The summer camp was tucked away in the hills, surrounded by miles of dense forest. It wasn't my first year as a counselor, but it was my first at this camp, Camp Blackthorn. It sounded quaint, didn't it? A place for kids to learn archery and make s'mores, not the sort of place you'd feel uncomfortable walking through after dark. The cabins were basic rows of bunk beds and a shared bathroom at the end of the block. Mine was cabin 4, home to 10 kids between the ages of 10 and 12. Boys and girls slept in separate cabins, of course, but during the day they all mingled in the field playing football or splashing about in the lake. It was my job to keep them safe, happy and alive until their parents came back. The days passed in a blur of sunscreen, bug spray and campfire songs. By the third day I could finally remember all their names: Callum, Sophie, Harper, Mia, Jake, Noah, Isla, Ethan, Ruby and Oliver. Except there was another one. I noticed him during the afternoon craft session. He was sitting at the end of one of the long wooden tables, hunched over his work. His hair was dark and his shirt was plain grey. Nothing about him stood out really. He could have been any one of the dozen kids scribbling away with crayons. I walked past him to collect some scissors and paused when I realized I didn't know his name. That wasn't unusual. I'd only just gotten the hang of the others after all. I glanced at the clipboard where I'd written down the cabin assignments. His face didn't match any of the names. The rest of the day went on as usual, but I kept an eye out for him. He was quiet, keeping to himself during games and meals. When I called roll that night, he wasn't there. I stayed up later than I usually would, sitting by the cabin door. Maybe he'd snuck out, or maybe he'd been in the wrong cabin all along. It wouldn't have been the first time a kid had wandered into the wrong place, though most of them made a fuss about it. In the morning, I asked around. None of the other counselors had an extra kid in their groups. The camp director frowned at me like I was trying to be funny when I mentioned it. When we lined up for breakfast, he was there again, standing towards the back of the line, his grey shirt too large for his frame. I was certain of it now, he wasn't on the roster. I asked one of the other kids about him. She just looked confused. The schedule was packed that day: archery, a hike to the old quarry, swimming at the lake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to keep track of him, but every time I looked away he seemed to disappear. Then I'd spot him again, just out of the corner of my eye. That night I counted heads as they filed into the cabin. 10 kids, not 11. 10. I went outside and checked the bathrooms, the path leading down to the main campfire pit, even the space under the cabin where the raccoons sometimes dug around. Nothing. The night was quiet except for the chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of the trees. I barely slept. Every creak of the bunk beds, every shuffle of a sleeping bag made my heart jump. By the time breakfast rolled around, I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore. I scanned the dining hall, the playground, the trails leading into the woods. No grey shirt, no dark hair. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept expecting him to turn up, but he didn't. When night fell, I counted the kids again, 10. The same 10 I'd been looking after all week. The last night of camp, we had the big bonfire down by the lake. Kids roasted marshmallows and told spooky stories. I was supposed to stay close to my group, but I couldn't help scanning the edges of the gathering looking for him. When the fire died down and the kids headed back to their cabins, I stayed behind. The embers glowed faintly in the dark, and the lake was perfectly still. I turned to leave and saw him standing at the edge of the water. His grey shirt looked damp, clinging to his frame, and his dark hair hung down over his face. I took a step towards him, and he turned. The movement wasn't fast or sudden, but it made my stomach drop. The water behind him rippled, though there hadn't been any wind. I didn't move closer. He looked at me, then stepped back into the lake, the ripples spreading outward as the water rose up to his knees, his waist, his chest. He kept walking until he was gone. We'd been camping out in the Welsh wilderness for 3 nights already when the sound began. It wasn't anything special to start with, just faint clicks coming through the small handheld radios we used to keep in touch when splitting off during hikes. The area was remote, no towns for miles, just hills and trees stretching out in every direction. The sky was huge above us, clear most nights except for a few wisps of cloud that drifted lazily past the stars. We'd picked the spot because it was isolated, because it was peaceful. The radios were old ones Tom had brought along, relics from his dad's time in the army. They'd worked perfectly up until that point, scratchy and distorted sometimes, but always reliable. The clicks came through in the early evening, just as we were finishing dinner by the campfire. Short bursts of sound, a few seconds apart, like someone tapping on glass. It wasn't alarming at first. We thought it might be interference, some distant weather station broadcasting on the same frequency, or a stray signal bouncing through the hills. The woods had a way of amplifying noises, carrying them in strange directions. By the second day, the clicks were more frequent. They weren't constant, but they came often enough to make us pause whenever one of us used the radios. It was the kind of sound that got under your skin, sharp and quick, like a warning you couldn't quite understand. We laughed about it at first, the lot of us sitting around the fire, telling ghost stories and joking about how someone out there might be listening in. But as the night wore on, the clicks began to feel different. The firelight made the trees at the edge of the clearing look taller than they should have, their trunks twisting and reaching into the night. Tom tried switching channels, fiddling with the dials on the radios, but the clicks always came back. It wasn't until the third night that things went wrong. We'd gone to bed early, tired from a long day of hiking. The fire was just embers by then, glowing faintly against the dark. My sleeping bag felt damp against my skin, and the air in the tent smelled like smoke and grass. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, the tent was filled with light, not the soft glow of the fire, but something bright and piercing, so strong it made my head pound. It wasn't like torchlight or headlights from a car. It was too clean, too perfect, spilling in through every seam and gap in the fabric. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag and unzipped the tent. The others were already out, their faces pale and bewildered in the glow. It lit up the entire clearing, casting no shadows, leaving everything exposed and stark. Tom was shouting something, but I couldn't make out his words. The radios were in his hands, all of them screeching. It was an awful noise, high-pitched and jagged, cutting through the stillness like broken glass dragged across stone. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the light vanished. The darkness rushed back in, heavier than before, as if it had been waiting. For a moment, we just stood there, blinking against the afterimage burned into our retinas. It took me longer than it should have to realize that something was missing. Greg wasn't with us. We searched the campsite first, calling his name, shining torches into the trees. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, his boots neatly placed beside it. He'd been there when we went to bed, but now there was no sign of him. The radios were dead. Tom tried every channel, every dial, but all we got was static. The fire refused to catch again, no matter how much kindling we piled on. Even our phones were useless, their screens black, their batteries drained. We spread out into the woods, sticking close enough to see each other's torch beams. The forest was silent, the way it gets just before a storm, when every animal seems to hold its breath. Every time we thought we'd found something, a broken branch, a patch of flattened grass, it led to nothing. The light had erased everything, swallowed it whole. By the time dawn came, we were back at the campsite, cold and exhausted. None of us slept. We packed up in silence, shoving tents and supplies into our rucksacks, our movements hurried and clumsy. Tom stayed behind for a while, staring at the spot where the fire had been, the radio still clutched in his hands. When he finally stood, his face was blank, drained of all the usual bravado. We didn't talk much on the way back, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The forest felt smaller, the trees pressing closer with every step. When we reached the main road, we piled into the car and drove without looking back. Greg's parents reported him missing the next day. Search teams combed the woods for weeks, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign he'd ever been there at all. We didn't tell anyone about the light or the clicks on the radios. It wasn't like anyone would have believed us anyway. We found the clearing after trudging through the woods for hours. It was like something out of a postcard, a wide open space framed by towering trees, the grass soft underfoot, and not a single sign of litter or footprints. It was Tom who spotted it first, standing on a fallen log and pointing ahead, his voice cutting through the sound of our boots crunching on twigs. We dropped our bags near the center and flopped down, panting. The sun was still high and the light made everything feel warm and safe. It felt private, untouched, like we'd stumbled onto some hidden gem no one else knew about. We spent the afternoon setting up camp, pitching 2 tents and starting a fire pit. Someone joked that it was too perfect, like something out of a story where things go wrong later. As the sun dipped lower, we started to notice little things. The trees near the edge of the clearing were marked, long grooves etched deep into the bark. At first we thought they might be from deer, but the patterns didn't fit. Some of the marks were higher up than seemed natural, others clustered in strange, almost deliberate shapes. Tom said it was probably just animals, scratching to mark their territory, but none of us really believed him. We shrugged it off and focused on cooking dinner over the fire. The smell of burning wood mixed with the earthy scent of the forest, and for a while it was easy to forget the marks. It wasn't until later that I spotted the first camera. I was gathering more wood for the fire when I noticed the glint of something metallic in the bushes. I thought it might be trash at first, some forgotten tin left behind by hikers. But when I bent closer, I realized it was a small camouflage camera mounted on a thin metal stake. It was angled towards the clearing. Its lens pointed directly at our campsite. I didn't say anything right away. I figured someone else must have seen it too, but when I glanced back at the fire, the others were laughing and joking, oblivious. The woods felt quieter somehow, like the usual rustling of leaves and calls of birds had faded without us noticing. After dinner, as the fire crackled low, I wandered to the edge of the clearing, pretending I needed the loo. I found another camera near the base of a tree, its lens half hidden behind a cluster of leaves. Further out, there was another, and another. By the time I got back, my chest felt tight, and the air around the fire seemed sharper. I sat down and scanned the clearing again, my eyes drawn to the trees. For the first time, I noticed how neatly they framed the space, almost as though they'd been planted that way. Tom suggested we call it a night, and everyone grumbled, but agreed. We split off into the two tents, zipping ourselves in and joking about bears or wolves. I lay there listening to the others settle, my mind racing. I couldn't stop picturing the cameras, the marks on the trees, the way the clearing had felt so welcoming at first. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up. It wasn't because of a noise. There wasn't one, but the stillness was different. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing darker than I'd ever seen it. I looked towards the trees, half expecting to see movement, but nothing stood out. Then the smell hit me. It was faint, but unmistakable, like something damp and rotting. It clung to the air, sharp and sour, and made my stomach turn. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby, but it seemed to be everywhere at once. I glanced back at the tents. The others were still zipped up, no sign anyone else was awake. I grabbed a torch and stepped out, the beam cutting through the dark in uneven patches. The smell grew stronger as I moved towards the edge of the clearing. That's when I noticed the trap. It was crude but effective, a shallow pit covered with branches and leaves, lined with jagged metal spikes. My foot had almost gone through the thin layer of camouflage. Nearby, there were others, each one hidden just as carefully. My stomach churned. The marks on the trees weren't random, they were markers. The cameras weren't someone's leftover project, they were monitoring us. The clearing wasn't untouched, it was bait. I stumbled back towards the tents, my heart racing, but the smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was coming from all around me, from the trees, the ground, the air itself. When I reached the tents, they were open. The others were gone. Their bags were still there, their boots and torches untouched, but the sleeping bags were empty. I called out, my voice cracking, but the only answer was the wind moving through the trees. I ran for the center of the clearing, spinning in circles, my torch beam darting wildly. The cameras were still there, hidden but watching. I could feel it. The smell pressed in, and the clearing felt smaller, the trees closer than they'd been before. I thought I saw movement, just a flash at the edge of the torchlight. But when I turned, there was nothing. I didn't stop to grab my bag. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, tripping over roots and tearing my clothes on brambles. The smell followed me, clinging to my skin. I don't remember how I made it back to the main road. When I did, the sun was rising and the forest looked calm, as though nothing had happened. I never went back for the others. I couldn't. We drove out to the woods just after noon, the car stuffed with tents, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us a week. It was one of those rare late autumn days when the sun hung in the sky like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to shine or give up altogether. I sat in the back, wedged between a cooler and a rucksack, and watched the trees blur into one continuous wall of green and brown. We were heading to a spot Tom had found online, some remote campsite miles from anywhere, the kind of place where people go to really disconnect. The road turned to gravel and then dirt. Eventually, It was barely a road at all, just ruts cutting through the woods. We parked where it ended and hiked the last mile, lugging our gear through the undergrowth. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional bird overhead. The clearing was perfect, exactly like Tom had described. Flat enough for tents, ringed by trees tall enough to block the wind, and with a small stream trickling along one edge. We set up camp quickly, the four of us working in that awkward, clumsy way people do when they're not used to it. By the time the sun started dipping, the tents were up, the fire pit was built, and we were sitting around it, laughing and passing around a bag of marshmallows. It was nice, peaceful even. The kind of evening you forget is possible until you're in the middle of it. Things changed after dark. Lila was the first to notice it. I think she kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the trees like she was expecting something to step out from between them. I told myself she was just jumpy. She wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right to be on edge. The fire crackled and spat, and the forest around us seemed darker than it should have been. It wasn't just the absence of streetlights or car headlights or the glow of a phone screen. It was the kind of dark that swallows everything, where the trees become nothing more than shapes, and the space between them seems to stretch into forever. Tom got up to use the bathroom, wandering off with the torch in hand. He didn't go far, just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire, but it felt like he'd disappeared entirely. We waited for him to come back, the silence pressing in on us. 10 minutes passed, then 20. We called his name, all three of us, our voices bouncing back from the trees. There was no answer. Lila suggested we go look for him. None of us wanted to, not really, but we couldn't just sit there. We grabbed torches and headed in the direction he'd gone, fanning out slightly to cover more ground. It wasn't long before we found the footprints. They were faint, pressed into the soft earth where the light barely reached. They led deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees. We followed them for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. And then they stopped. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbed leaves or broken branches. The prints just ended, as if Tom had stepped off the earth entirely. That's when the scream came. It was Tom's voice, or something that sounded like it, calling out from somewhere ahead of us. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling, twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. We didn't think. We just ran towards it, crashing through the undergrowth, our torches swinging wildly, but there was nothing. No Tom, no sign of him, just the dark, the trees, and the sound of our breathing. When we turned back to camp, we realized Anna was gone. She'd been with us, right behind me. I was sure of it, but now there was nothing. Her torch lay on the ground where she must have dropped it, the beam pointing into the trees like a single accusing finger. We didn't wait after that. We didn't talk about what might have happened or whether we should keep searching. We just grabbed what we could carry and ran, leaving the tents and the fire and everything else behind. The woods seemed different as we stumbled through them. The trees closer together, the ground uneven and slick. The sound of the stream faded away, replaced by something else, a faint rustling that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When we finally found the car, it was still dark, and the engine stuttered before it roared to life. I didn't look back as we drove away. The others never turned up. Not Tom, not Anna, and sometimes when it's quiet, I think I can hear that scream again. The forest wasn't far from the edge of town. It was one of those places you knew about but never went to. Not because it was forbidden or anything, though it was, but because it had an air about it that said, don't bother. Still, rules were made to be broken, and when you're 17 with your mates egging you on, it's easy to push past that little voice in your head telling you not to go. We squeezed through the gap in the rusted chain-link fence, the sign hanging from it. Restricted area, no trespassing, swung slightly in the breeze. The letters faded, but clear enough. I brushed against it as I went through, feeling the roughness of the metal against my arm. Inside, the trees seemed closer together than they had looked from the outside. The sun barely cut through the canopy, but we didn't mind. It felt like we were explorers, pushing into some forgotten world. Every snap of a branch underfoot echoed louder than it should have. Every bird call seemed out of place. I kept my hands stuffed into my jacket pockets, fingers curling tight around the fabric, though I'd never have admitted why. It didn't take long to find signs that someone else had been there before us. deep furrows in the earth like someone had dragged something heavy. The edges were ragged, the kind of thing you don't see from machines or animals, just people. That should have been enough to send us back the way we came, but we didn't even stop to think about it. Curiosity is a funny thing. It pulls you along even when you don't want to follow. The traps came next. A snare tied with rusting wire dangling from a branch. A pit camouflaged with leaves and twigs, just shallow enough to avoid breaking a leg if you fell in, but deep enough to hurt. The air felt different then, sharper, and the trees seemed to press in even tighter. It was like walking into someone's living room uninvited. We pressed on, though, laughing it off, trying to prove to one another we weren't scared. Then we found the graves. They weren't much at first glance, just mounds of dirt, some with little wooden crosses hammered into the ground at odd angles. No names, no dates, just markers. They were all over the place, scattered in no pattern I could make out, and each one was a little too neat for nature's doing. One of us, I don't even remember who, kicked at one of the crosses. It toppled with a thud that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't say anything, but the air seemed different after that, charged. I wanted to leave. The sun started dipping low, the kind of light that turns everything orange and makes shadows stretch long. It was harder to see where we were going, but nobody wanted to admit they didn't know the way back. We kept walking, tripping over roots and getting slapped by branches, and then we noticed we weren't alone. Footprints, fresh, in the soft dirt near the graves, leading off deeper into the woods. Too big to be ours, too recent to ignore. There was something unsettling about their shape, though. Not wrong exactly, but different enough to notice. We kept moving, trying to laugh it off, but every sound made me jump. A crack of a branch, a rustle in the leaves. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. Then came the whistle. It cut through the air, clear and sharp, and stopped us dead. It wasn't a tune, just a single piercing note. We spun around, eyes darting, but the trees all looked the same in every direction. We walked faster after that, not saying a word. The sun was almost gone now, and the woods were getting darker by the second. Every step felt like it was taking us further in instead of out. The traps weren't just behind us anymore. They were ahead too, and to the sides, like they'd shifted when we weren't looking. One of us, Mark, I think, nearly fell into another pit, only catching himself at the last second. Then we found the cabin. It was small, slapped together with mismatched boards, the roof sagging on one side. There was no light inside, no smoke from a chimney, but it felt occupied. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the faint breeze. I couldn't see inside, and I didn't want to. We didn't go in, no one said anything, but we all felt it. Something was watching us from that cabin, just out of sight. The whistle came again, and this time it was closer. My legs felt frozen, but I forced myself to move. We ran, stumbling through the trees, branches clawing at our faces and clothes. I could hear something behind us, the snapping of twigs and the crunch of leaves, but I didn't dare look back. We didn't find the fence. I don't know how long we ran, but the woods never ended. The dark swallowed us whole, and the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, the pace quickening. I can still feel the air from that night, still see the mounds of dirt, and sometimes, when it's quiet, I hear the whistle again. We'd been hiking all day, our boots crunching over damp earth and broken twigs as we followed the trail deeper into the forest. The sun was low, filtering through the trees in amber streaks, and the air smelled of moss and decay. It was meant to be an adventure, just the four of us in the wilderness. We'd joked about bears and getting lost, but we weren't far from civilization, just a day's hike out from the car park. That's what we told ourselves anyway. We were looking for a place to camp when we stumbled across it. At first it seemed like we'd found someone else's site. A dome tent stood beneath a cluster of pines, its fabric streaked with mud. Nearby a fire ring sat cold, its stones blackened. A half-packed rucksack leaned against the base of a tree, its contents spilling onto the ground. A pair of socks, a water bottle, a crumpled map. It looked recent, too recent. We called out, expecting someone to appear from the trees, but there was no answer. The tent flap hung open and the inside was a mess. Clothes were scattered across the floor. A sleeping bag lay unzipped, its stuffing poking through a tear. There were food wrappers everywhere, along with a tin of beans tipped on its side, the contents congealed in the dirt. It didn't make sense. People didn't just leave their things behind like that. Even if they'd been in a rush, you'd think they'd take the rucksack or at least pack up some of the gear. We speculated, maybe they'd gone for a walk and gotten turned around, Or maybe they'd run into trouble and had to leave in a hurry. We decided to set up our own camp a short distance away. None of us said it, but the idea of sleeping right there in that abandoned site didn't sit well. The forest felt different as the light faded. The trees pressed in closer, their branches twisting into unfamiliar shapes. Even the air seemed colder. By the time we'd pitched our tents and started a fire, the last of the daylight had gone. The flames cast a flickering circle of light, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. We ate in silence, each of us glancing toward the abandoned site as if expecting someone to emerge. That's when we heard it. It was faint at first, a distant sound carried on the wind, a soft, high-pitched wail that rose and fell in uneven intervals. We froze, straining to listen. It came again, closer this time, crying. It sounded like a woman or maybe a child. The noise prickled the hair on the back of my neck. One of us suggested it might be an animal, foxes or something. They make noises that can sound human, but this didn't. This was different. It had a desperation to it, a rawness that felt wrong out there in the middle of nowhere. We debated what to do. Staying put felt safe, but the sound kept coming, growing louder. The idea of ignoring it seemed impossible. What if someone needed help? What if it was one of the campers who'd vanished from the abandoned site? We grabbed torches and headed toward the noise, our boots crunching over leaves and twigs. The beam of my light shook as I swept it across the forest floor, revealing nothing but trunks and undergrowth. The crying seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the trees. Then it stopped. We stood there, surrounded by the dark, our breaths visible in the cold air. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then there was a scream, a piercing, guttural cry that ripped through the night. It was close, too close. We turned and ran. Back at the camp, the fire was out, the embers cold. The tents looked wrong, as if they'd been moved or shifted somehow. My heart hammered as I scanned the area, expecting to see something, someone standing there, but it was empty. None of us slept. We sat huddled together, clutching torches and knives, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch. The forest seemed alive with sound, whispers, footsteps, the faintest hint of laughter. When dawn came, we packed up and left without a word. As we passed the abandoned campsite, I glanced at the tent. Its flap was closed now, the fabric stretched tight as if someone was inside. We didn't stop to check.